This is The Wilderness and the Wellspring, a podcast about exploring the creative process. I'm your host, Jeff Lunt. This is episode 20, my interview with CompositionKat. Kat is someone I met online recently via bluesky. She's a professional game developer and author, and she's recently made the decision to branch out and start doing her own thing, start her own business, and pursue her own creative goals. Our discussion covers work, the industry, your relationship to work, and what it's like to decide to make the leap into being an independent creative person. So I really think you're going to enjoy this. You can check out Kat's work online. She can be found in a couple of places on bluesky under the username @CompositionKat with a K, and the same spelling on Substack under CompositionKat. So Kat, welcome to the Wilderness and the Wellspring. Thanks for agreeing to be on the show, especially so short notice. We just met virtually online yesterday on bluesky, just talking about some stuff. I had posted something that said, every day that I get to work on making games is a great day. And you responded, and we wound up having this whole spiraling conversation for hours.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It's pretty exciting. It's my first podcast. But yeah, I saw your post and I was like, well, I wonder if it is exciting to work on games every day when you work in games, because I actually have been working in games for the past 4 years. I did 2 years on a mobile app and then 2 years in an Unreal game engine doing sort of the client UI front end. And I found that it's sort of a mixed bag, which is why I was probing to find out what you thought about it. And we had a really interesting conversation, which was like the whole day. I was drinking coffee. I don't know what you were drinking, but yeah, we had Sunday morning coffee chats just about work. And then we have apparently run into some similar interesting phenomenon at work. I think one of my favorite parts was this one chart that I drew, it was basically a linear increasing trend with a bunch of local mins and maxes of your positivity over time at work, and how you sort of go through cycles of like, oh yeah, everything's great. I'm really happy in my job and everything's awesome. And then you'll sort of crash and be like, wow, what am I doing with my life? Everything's horrible. Why did I even think I should be in this field? I don't know how to do it. Like, I don't know. And I also think that that's probably similar with software development. You sort of go through the same thing. Anyway, it was a super fun chat, and it's very exciting to a little bit more than 24 hours later be doing a podcast to follow up.
Yeah, it's very natural. It was really fun. I remember my initial reaction because I posted that. I was just trying to start my day off with some positivity, and I was looking forward to some programming later. And your response was a question, and it was very neutral.
Yeah.
But, my self-consciousness kicked in, and I didn't know who you were. Your question was like, it was
query :
yeah.
Do you feel like it's a good day all the time if it's also your job or something like that?
Yeah. And I immediately was like, is this person about to lecture me about how you don't even know what you're talking about? I work in the games industry. I was like, okay, that'll be interesting. Or was it a neutral question, or was it curiosity? And it turned out to be the positive thing. Yeah. I was ready for all of them because I was like, well, I should respond neutrally and be curious about this person and see what happens. But yeah, I was like, no, positivity is kind of like, I was like, well, it's a conscious choice, and I definitely have ups and downs was kind of my take.
Yeah. Yeah. It started off your first response, which I was actually also like, oh, wow, like someone actually responded with a multiple threaded message with very detailed information about what they thought about it. I was like, this is so interesting. But your first batch of answers was sort of more like positive, neutral. And then we got more fun as the hours went on.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have your post here. Your initial response was, query, have you made games in corporate? Curious if you're able to maintain this positivity in that environment. And I was like, that's a really good question. I get that question. I build business software for my day job. So I got this question so many times over the years in different forms, which is, like you said, is it so easy to be positive when it's your job?
Yeah.
And no, I don't think it is, because you have limited control. We started talking about, game dev as a hobby or versus a job, or anything as a hobby versus a job. There's this whole dimension of how much control you have over the day-to-day and the decisions and where you're going and all that stuff. You want to dive into that a little bit? I've not worked in the games industry, and you have, and I'm curious your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's probably, and I've worked a little bit in business software too, and it ends up being very similar where you have someone who needs something done. Let's just call it a client, which may even be in gaming, the same studio which you work for, but you end up sort of operating as separate entities. And then you have the classic problem of the client not knowing what they actually want. And then you have sort of a structured, layered issue where there's all these subsegments, especially at a large studio where I'm a developer and I maybe have a small feature team working on some goal. And that may or may not include a producer, an artist, et cetera. Or you could even have it where it's segmented off into, okay, the designers are in one group, the producers are in one group, the artists are in another group, and then you have to communicate to each other to get what you need done. And anyway, back to the main point is the designers often are sort of on their own, especially when you're working on a product that's rolling out and going live. The developers sort of get spun off working separately on the goals for whatever it was that we already started. And so when they start doing the planning, the engineers aren't necessarily included in that. Maybe there's a tech lead that was included or an engineering manager that was included. And so by the time I see the designs, I haven't really had a say in it, but there've been a bunch of iterations of what it's going to look like. And I started rambling and sort of losing the main thread here, but essentially you don't have a lot of control over what you're getting asked to build because you don't get to be included in the design phases, and you end up coming in late, and where you may have some very important questions about how this design even fulfills and answers the main goal. So also you'll have product will have done some sort of research. Often in games, it's sort of like, hey, look, a competitor did this, let's do it, which is also kind of sad. Like people want to be creative. We want to do something new, which I can also understand from a business perspective why they would choose, okay, let's take a feature that already exists and was successful in this game and try to apply it to our game. I get why they're interested in doing that, but it is not the most fun. Back to the main is
certainly not the most creative, no.
Yeah. You often sort of get this sort of half conceptualized idea of what needs to happen. And then you have to make it into reality. And while you're working on chipping away at it and making it into an actual statue, you find out that they tried to put like two arms on one side of the body. And you're like, I don't know why you thought this was going to be a good idea. I'd like to discuss why maybe you should put one arm on each side of the body, but we can build it with two arms on one side of the body if you really want. Anyway.
I'm sure the next obvious question is, well, which one's cheaper / faster, right?
Yes.
They're like,
there's a
forget
lot
about
of
arms.
that too.
Arms are just a concept. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they're like, well, can you tell us how long it would take to build one arm? And then could you tell us how long it would take to build two arms? And then could you tell us how long it would take to build two arms on one side? And it's like, okay, well, I could tell you all of those things, but in order to figure that out, I would need to go and take a look at it. So like, give me a couple of days to figure out exactly how we would even build something with two arms on one side, which is also difficult to get the time for. But yeah, that was sort of a rambly answer to, you don't have as much control. And in games, a lot of the times, at least where I've worked, is a studio where the designers are determining what you're going to be working on, which is essentially product. It can be a couple of different types of people. And then you also get into the interesting issue, which I think is relevant in a lot of engineering fields, where you have multiple bosses. So the way that we've structured a lot of engineering now, at least at the places where I've worked, is engineering is sort of run by producers in the sense that the producers are wrangling all of these tickets, often in Jira or some other ticket managing software. And you're sort of being, my instinct was to say barraged, but that's not necessarily an appropriate word for what's happening when the producers are asking you about tickets, but barraged with like, hey, can we get this done? Hey, can we do this? Hey, can we do this? And so you're constantly getting ticket picked at by the producers. And then also it's like, you know, the art director will be like, hey, we need to do this thing. Like, how can we do this? And so it's like, okay, well, now I have to go figure out how to do that. And there's all sorts of ways you can use to push back and make sure that you keep your time safe. But in essence, there's a lot of people asking you to do different things, some of which are tracked, some of which are not tracked. And you end up sort of being beholden to the requests of a bunch of different subsections of people inside of your environment. Mm-hmm. And then you see all of these issues where you have tons of tech debt, tons of other things, engineers that are sad, demoralized, like they want to do cool stuff, they want to build stuff, they don't want to be in meetings, but there's so many requests coming in from all over, which I think is where you would need to have an effective manager to be able to actually manage all of those things. And then that gets into a whole other conversation of managing engineers. Now I've talked for a long time, but was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
There's a ton in there. So on the one hand, it's comforting in a way, I guess, to know that, yes, indeed, developing software, regardless of what you're building, is basically exactly the same everywhere in every industry.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, you used a few words there, like the product group, the producers, different clients, all that stuff. Yeah, that's absolutely been my experience too. Somebody comes to you with an idea of like, oh, a competitor did this, so we'd like to add this thing too. Yeah, I've been through all of that exact same stuff. And then there was something else you mentioned. Oh, the analysis part, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone's trying to do this risk mitigation where they're trying to manage their, at the high level, they're trying to manage a budget while reaching a goal, asking you all these questions about diverging paths, hoping to somehow arrive at some optimal solution that gets delivered on time or whatever. And then I'm sure you also have at least a few engineers who, during that conversation in those meetings, they don't want to be in the first place. They're like, it would take less time to just do this than to talk about it, right? And then that's a whole nother layer, right? You've got all these people that are very creative driven. They want to be building. And yet there are other times too, where you're like, hold on, no, the conversation's valuable. We need to talk. We need to take all these conversations in. And yeah, there's a lot there. So the biggest thing I took away from that is when I was a kid and first thought I wanted to go into games, that's how I got into programming, is just messing around with my own stuff. Is I just imagined it as this pure creative thing,
Yeah.
Which
I think that we all think that.
Yeah, exactly. Like in any kind of studio system where there's a lot of people involved and budgets and timelines and all this stuff, it just turns into the same model pretty much everywhere, which is interesting. And I'm curious, like, tell me a little bit about your journey in terms of what you expected before you went in the industry, how it's evolved over time, and like kind of back to the original question, like, is this all fun when it's your job? What's kind of your relationship to the reality of what it is now?
I think my initial impression of what I thought it was going to be goes back to, of course, childhood. And I thought that it was going to be really fun and creative. And then as I went through life and I understood more, by the time I was graduating college, I actually really wanted to join in game development at that time. But I was really worried around that time. I can't remember exactly when, but there was certain stuff that came out of different game studios, especially regarding women in games industry. And I was a little bit concerned about that. I haven't actually experienced any of that being in it myself. And that may also be related to growing up with brothers. And so I'm more used to dealing with the sorts of things that come with that. But maybe the only thing that I've experienced in terms of possible gender-related issues would be sort of taking on a secretary role. But I think that that's more so due to my organizational skills and the fact that I remember what happens in meetings. So people come to me and ask me for all of the information. That was one thing I was really worried about going into the games industry that hasn't actually affected me at all. And then the other thing was the low pay and long hours. And the pay actually is totally fine, very on par with what I might be earning in business software, which I was surprised by. I think due to working for large studios. So the first place that I worked, the game was making like $100,000 a day or something when I joined. And then by the time I left, it was like 300,000. So they were not hurting for money and they were able to pay me a reasonable amount. And then the next studio was even bigger. And so they just weren't even worried about that sort of thing. So they were able to pay their devs along with the rest of the market. So basically, I had multiple preconceived notions based on sort of blanket assumptions about the industry that didn't end up being all that true. The other one is hours. And I also found that to not be a huge issue. I was able to work for the most part just the regular 40 hours a week and disconnect. The caveat there being that for my personality type, I tend to take a stronger amount of ownership over something that I've started to invest in. And so I would end up spending time outside of work after hours thinking about all of the problems, especially when they started having me lead features. And so it was like, okay, now I am in charge of making sure that this actually all happens, which caused me to spend more mental effort outside of hours thinking about it. But overall, I feel like all my preconceived notions ended up being incorrect, and that it essentially ends up being just like any other job, just with a few extra fun bits of you have a game at the end of it, and the type of people that you're working with are all nerds. So you have a lot more to talk about at, say, the company book club, things like that.
True. Yeah. That's a nice aspect too. Yeah. I had a similar expectation roller coaster and then kind of landed in just like it's a job kind of place. I, of course, always imagined that, I'd be working on the next whatever big, insert game that you absolutely love, the next Star Wars game or the first person shooter from id or something like that.
Yeah.
And I had similar concerns. So like when I was in college, this would have been like 2001, there was a game news website that would cover industry stuff. And a bunch of things started coming out about electronic arts, about crunch culture. And I was like, oh, that sounds terrible.
Yeah.
Do I really want to do this? And I knew somebody that worked in games at the time, and I kind of asked their opinion. I was eager to get any job in games.
Yeah.
And I think at the time, it was either right then or maybe a few years later, World of Warcraft had come out, and it was all abuzz. Everybody was in love with it. And I was thinking about applying just for like a customer service role. I was like, I'll work in the call center. I'll get to know some people. I'll work my way in, whatever. And I had some programming experience, not professional stuff, but I had some background in education. And the response I got back was, well, if you want to use it as a way to like move to the Bay Area and get in the scene, like fine, but don't expect that job to be fun, and they basically just disabused me of all my hopes and dreams. I was like, oh, okay. So I wound up going into corporate IT for like 10 years, which turned out to be great. Yeah, it turned out to be great for totally different reasons. But anyway, I just wound up in roles where I was like, hey, where's all this creativity I'm still waiting for? And I kept holding out this hope that like, oh, there's some job somewhere, there's some project, there's some game or whatever, where I can just be a worker bee and be really happy and be constantly creating. I found that to be not really true, but also, it's a myth, but it's also okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, like you said, work 40 hours a week. You have some separation, even though you have like a overactive sense of ownership. I have the same thing. Yeah. It's like, I can't not think about work. I'm not at work.
To just jump on that real quick, I feel the thing for me that gets me is when I have something that I haven't written down on a list, or that I haven't accounted for yet, or that I need to tell someone else so that they know that that is still something that needs to happen. So if I have anything that's sort of dangling, and I think I used this term before, a dangling thread of something that needs to get done, that's what always gets me. I really just need to write everything down so that I can leave it and then come back to it. And then if I think of something while I'm not working, go write it down somewhere.
I think that's huge. And you touched on the sort of secretary role you find yourself in.
Yeah.
It's been my experience that the most organized person on any team winds up playing that role regardless.
Yeah.
On my current team, I hear all the time from the engineers that they're so grateful that there's somebody that's super organized. And on the one hand, I'm like, well, I mean, it's just a matter of like going to meetings, writing things down, asking follow-up questions, and then putting it in a doc we can all see and follow up on. On the one hand, I'm like, that's all it is. But people see that as such drudgery sometimes. Do you feel like that's led to part of why you're trusted more and sort of like given features to lead and things like that?
I would think so. I think anything that increases your visibility, and especially I think that the most important is my ability to follow up on these sort of dangling threads, is people, if they give me something, it's not just that I do. So for example, a bug, there'll be a bug and it's like, hey, this isn't working. And so for one level, you might just fix the surface problem. Okay, now it's not doing the issue. But I like to go deeper to find out where it broke at the beginning and then try to fix that issue with business constraints. Okay, maybe it's really complicated. It'll involve a refactor, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you decide to just do the cheaper fix. But I think it more so leads from that place, which is sort of tied into organization, is being able to connect everything communicate to people that need communicating to reach the end goal without needing additional follow-ups, which is also somewhat problematic because I've noticed, especially for producers, since I'm very organized and producers are often in charge of multiple teams, at least in the areas I've been in, they sort of just ignore me. They let me do that work for the project that I'm on because they trust me to be able to take care of it. So I have to be more vocal about, hey, I need support on this piece, because I have fallen into that trap before where I'll be very organized. So people will just ignore the pieces that I'm working on because, of course, everyone's trying to do their job, get the things done that they need to do so that they can go home for the day, et cetera, et cetera. They have other problems. So if I'm sort of solving a problem, they don't need to pay attention to it, which isn't necessarily the best thing overall. Because I mean, I make mistakes, I miss things. So I have to be more explicit in asking for support in that regard.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think anywhere where you can demonstrate that you can be trusted to just take care of something, it's exactly that dichotomy you're talking about. On the one hand, it's like, oh, great, I get to be more in control of these decisions and how it flows out and all that. But to your point, I think it's super common for the people asking you to do that work to then divert more of their attention to the fires, to the things that are burning down and need some kind of rescue or something.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like abandoned is probably too strong of a word, but sometimes you're just like, hey, hello, like we could do great things together if we actually put more energy into what's working.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. But I just have to learn how to ask for help more. That's one thing that I need to work on is delegating and communicating those, because I definitely tend to, if this is a problem that I can solve, I prefer to solve it on my own. Whereas especially if you have junior engineers on the team, it's actually better if you can say, hey, I know how to solve this problem, but here, this is a problem that I know you can handle. And then if they have issues, you can then walk them through how they would solve the problem, which arguably takes the same amount of time, if not more. There's a bunch of other stuff you can get into there. Yeah. But for the growth of the more junior devs on the team can be very helpful.
Yeah, it's tough, especially if you're in a situation where a project is, I would say it's really common toward deadlines where you want to just go in and fix the thing, but you also want to help the engineer grow. And it's not just an altruistic thing. It's like, okay, as the person leading this thing, you want stronger people under you that you can delegate things to. So yeah, if I help an engineer today, if I take extra time to help them see how to connect these dots, then the next time I need these dots connected, they can do it, which is going to happen because it's going to happen 100 times in the next 3 years,
Yeah. I think that also sort of gets into long-term versus short-term investing in the team and how, especially when you get into sort of the institutional knowledge discussions and how often things don't get documented. People just sort of know how to do something. They end up doing that thing. Maybe two people do that, but maybe one of them leaves. And sort of spreading out who knows what, and especially in terms of the sort of software that I'm working on, I'm sure it's the same elsewhere. If you've been working on a feature, you're going to be able to fix those issues significantly faster than someone else. There's also a whole thing to talk about with producers trying to just throw an engineer in willy-nilly without understanding which areas of the code they are more in tune with so that they will be more effective at solving those problems. Granted, there's also benefits to mixing engineers around so that they can learn the other sections of the code. But that's sort of going to be more of a long-term gain as opposed to a short-term gain. There's so many different things to think about.
Yeah, because we're all cogs, right? So like, why is one cog any different? I want this project to go 3 times faster. I'll just get budget for 3 times as many engineers, right? It'll go perfectly.
It does not go perfectly.
I wanted to take a step back actually a little bit. We've gotten into the weeds of just normal workday stuff, which is great. But I actually want to cover a little bit more of your background. Like, how did you arrive at this? You have engineering skills. You're not just leading stuff, but you found yourself in leadership because you're organized and you can see how all the pieces fit together. Take me back to how you came into the industry, the kinds of stuff you were doing when you were new, and how you arrived at where you're at.
It sort of goes back to the beginning of my computer science was building HTML for Neopets Shop when I was a kid. So it was not very elaborate or anything, but I had a tiny bit of exposure there. And then going through school, there were a couple of opportunities. There was a class making, I can't even remember what it's called. Was it called the Giroux or something? It was very simple, logical systems to solve puzzles with this little kangaroo that you had to get to the end point. This is going way, way back. But basically, I had some exposure to coding concepts growing up. When I went to college, I actually wanted to be a chemical engineer. My grandfather was a chemical engineer, but then I took, and part of this is because I've always been interested in sort of math and logically how things work together. One of the classes that I hated was biology because there's so much memorization of all of the different terms and it's a lot less computational. And then in chemistry, freshman year, I took organic chemistry, which is a lot closer to biology. Now, there's a bunch in organic chemistry that's also computational, but there's also a lot of memorization. And that is when I started to be less interested in chemical engineering. And this is the very far back, very top level,
So it's like
my life.
not enough problem solving involved. Is that kind of, it's like the
Yeah.
creative spark of wanting to build something kind of, yeah?
Yeah. And chemistry was interesting to me because in my child brain, it was like, if I can understand how the core components of everything work, I can start to better understand how the entire world works, which is possibly too naive of an idea for chemistry because it's extremely complicated. But eventually I found computer science sophomore year. I just started taking a bunch of different classes, all in sort of STEM. My parents pushed me to do more technical, higher paying majors as opposed to something that might have been more fun for me, which would have been more creative because I've always enjoyed creative activities. And I'm actually glad that they did that. After all the classes that I took sophomore year, computer science stood out the most. We were actually able to make games in the first intro classes of the computer science at my college. And we made a Galaga shooter and a couple of other small projects. And so gaming and computer science have always been somewhat tied together for me. And that's how I ended up in computer science, is sort of general exposure and then experimenting in college, picking something that I thought would be able to pay well, which ended up being a good move. There was actually sort of a crisis my senior year where I went to my professor and I said, hey, I don't think I'm going to like doing this job. I think I've made a mistake. I don't think I should be doing computer science. And the professor was like, I'm sorry you feel that way, but at least you'll be making money and you at least are already almost done with this degree. So just finish it out. And it did all end up being fine. I think I was somewhat right in that I don't think I'm ever going to be completely happy being a software engineer. But overall, I think that life has worked out well. Back to sort of the overall question of how did I get into where I am? I graduated and I got a job doing business software. I did some more business software. And then I took some time off because I decided that I was not happy doing software engineering. And when I came back, which was about a year and a half, 2 years that I took off, I got into gaming. And so sort of the connect for me was business software is very boring for me in the sense that there's nothing visual. At least in games, there's a creative aspect. And I ended up doing a lot of front end UI work and all the pieces that I've worked on since I came back from my hiatus, because I really like having visual feedback and the ability to control how something looks. So general exposure, sort of wondering what to do, picking computer science, trying out business software. I was not happy at all. Actually, the thing that caused me to quit my job was actually getting into a relationship with my current boyfriend, because I was so happy in my personal life and I was so unhappy at work. I realized that I was doing something wrong and that I needed to figure out myself first before going back to work, because I don't know how to explain. It was so glaringly obvious to me that if I can be this happy with my boyfriend, like there's something wrong in this aspect of my life where I'm going to work and I'm essentially depressed. And then I think I sort of figured out that it's not the job that's the problem. It was me that was the problem. It's sort of the way that I was approaching things. And what we talked about a little bit in one of the threads is how you are going for a goal and you're trying to complete the goal. And I was very much goal oriented and sort of grinding. And I needed to focus more on the journey as opposed to the end result. And I was focusing my mental energy in the wrong area, which was making me have more negative emotions. And so after I took some time off, I tried a few different things and I started to feel a similar way, which was very indicative of the job is not the problem. I am the problem. And that there's things that I needed to work on with how I manage my emotions and how I think about things in order to fix that, to be able to sustain working while not being sad about life. If that makes sense.
More than you realize. Yeah, 100%. So that makes me think of this mental model I've had for my life for a long time. It's perhaps overly compartmentalized, but I've always kind of thought of my conscious life in three kind of buckets. One is work, because, I like having a roof over my head. It's a really nice thing.
It's important.
Whatever, interpersonal relationship that's like the most important in my life, like my marriage right now, for example. And then there's me time or my creative stuff that I tend to do more solo, but I don't do it for a living at this point. And it's not, I've certainly invited plenty of people I've dated into like, hey, this is a thing I'm into, and none of them care. They're supportive, but they're like, that's totally cool. That's you go do that. But like, they're just not nerdy about the same things in the same way. And that's okay. Yeah. So that kind of, I faced a similar struggle that you were talking about where certain aspects of your life are really happy and they seem to contrast very, very strongly with other parts of your life. And I basically had a similar choice and I chose work. I was like, I'm just going to work like crazy. And I think what you touched on is so perfect because there wasn't a right choice amongst those three. It was, how do you figure out how to manage all those things and kind of balance them so that overall as a person, you're happy? Because the over focus on any one area, and it's totally natural to do the one that makes you the happiest, or in my case, like I just always had this background fear of being broke. And so I focused on, I'm going to be less broke.
Yeah.
It still led to a lot of the same things you're talking about, which is it was totally out of whack, basically. I was putting way too much focus on one area, deprioritizing others, and it hurt. And I could never seem to escape this scenario where at least one of those three things just seemed to be getting no attention.
Yeah. I think that I wasn't able to, because, I only heard about you yesterday. I wasn't able to finish one of your podcasts about conflicting priorities. I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but I feel like that also touches into that. It's not just about your work tasks, conflicting priorities and managing that. It's also about your own personal development and managing your own personal priorities in addition to all of the work ones. I don't know if you talked about that at all in that podcast.
I vaguely remember it either.
Okay. So. I think it might have been towards the beginning of your list. I don't know. I picked a couple and was searching around.
I think the way that I've iterated on that problem, just to kind of bring it back to kind of the business analogy, is that because of that, growing up feeling like I always had this sort of money pressure, fear of going broke or whatever. And I equated that with if I ever had to go from the more comfortable life I've gotten by focusing on money, probably too much, because it sort of infects your brain in a way that's not entirely balanced or healthy either. So the way that I've approached that is noticing basically the same imbalance that you noticed, and then just saying, okay, well, I would like long-term for these three areas to feel about equal and pretty balanced, pretty happy, and to just wake up every day, or at least more often than not, just feeling like, things are pretty good.
Yeah.
Things are all right. And to be content with the fact that I'm just a person who has limitations and I can only do so much. And so when I was in my 20s, I really focused on the work part. And then I kind of came back to the interpersonal relationship, made that a priority, and then tried to kind of balance those two things. And then more recently, I've said, okay, I've been doing my career for 25 years or so. It's fine. I'm not going to be in a situation where people don't need technical people. So I can find something to do. So I feel safe that like I have a foundation I can lean on.
Yeah, you have a skill that's valuable in the market.
Right. So I could put less attention on that, put a lot of attention in my relationship and my marriage, and that's going really well. And now I'm like, okay, those two things are set. Now it's time for me to take the fact that I've got stable home life and I've got this work that I can lean on. And now how do I just incrementally find a little more time to do creative stuff, a little more.
Do you feel like a lot of the times, maybe in your 20s, any of the work for myself creative outlet just sort of got pushed 100% to the back burner? Or did you have any time where you were able to actually invest in some of your own creative outlets?
I did some creative stuff. I just didn't know how to turn it into the thing I was doing. I didn't know how to turn it into my job. I knew I could go try to get a job for somebody else creating their stuff. But to me, that felt pretty much like just doing a job. And it seemed like, well, I already have a job. So why don't I just keep doing what I'm good at? And I've always been doing something creative. I think I've kind of gone through three phases. One was games was the first love that I was really trying to pursue. Did that for a while, didn't feel like it was getting anywhere. And so I kind of put it down in order to focus on just jobs,
Yeah.
It's like building a career. And in fact, for a while, I had internalized this idea that I guess I'll just never be a game programmer. I guess I'll never make my own games. Mm-hmm. And so I stopped programming entirely for like 2 years and I went and did photography. So that was really fun. But that was a new creative pursuit combined with kind of accepting that the dream that I had in my head wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And then for a while, it was cooking and things like that. So I've had these different periods where because I was trying to face the fact that all my dreams weren't going to come true just because I wanted them to come true. I would occasionally put them down, but I think I've always tried to carve out some time for myself.
Yeah.
Because if I don't do something creative, I start to get really restless.
Yeah.
And that creative portion just gets out of balance and then it's just chaos. Yeah.
What kind of photography did you do?
I did mostly landscape stuff. I tried to get into portraiture for a little while. But
harder. You have to go find portrait people.
Yeah. And the funny thing is you talk to somebody that does it for a living, they're really good at it, and they make it sound really easy. The thing for me is I was just too self-conscious to talk to people.
Yeah.
And now I do this kind of stuff and it's way more comfortable for me, but I didn't see a path to doing that as my main creative thing. Yeah. And because I always had that foundation of like, well, I have to have a job. Like I was just driven that way, just wired that way.
Yeah.
Like I would never switch. I would never make a huge leap toward the creative life because I wanted to make absolutely certain as much as I could that I didn't have to worry about paying rent.
Speaking about the sort of feeling of always having a job, you had mentioned that you were worried about being broke essentially as one of your big motivating factors for choosing work when you sort of had a decision of what to focus on the most. Do you feel like you've gotten past that now and you're very comfortable? And that's also what helped you pick to choose balance as opposed to trying to go all in on, okay, I need to solve this money issue.
I think so. I saw it as I tried to balance those three things and I wasn't able to do it when I was younger. Yeah. And so I chose one thing to focus on entirely. And then slowly I started to reintegrate the other things. It was very messy along the way,
Yeah.
Like sometimes I would go to the other extreme and I'd be like, okay, ignore work, do this other thing. And that would just be harmful in another way, So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, because I also do not anything professional. I just like taking pictures of nature. So landscape like you were doing, or I also really like close-ups of flowers or anything. And sometimes weird shots, like there's a couple where it was water just off of a faucet, but like close up, and a few other weird framing, anything with like angles. So the photos where you take a photo of power lines where they have all these crisscrossing lines through the blue skyline, anything like that, I always find really interesting. And I haven't really figured out why, but it's another creative thing that I like to do too.
That sounds really cool. And doing those like studies in color and pattern and shape and stuff, I think is a very common part of the journey for sure. I still do photography a little bit, but it's just with my phone,
Yeah.
I have a nice camera, but it's like it usually stays over there because
it's too much work to get out.
Exactly. Yeah, it requires all this setup, And now I kind of think that I've entered my sort of Georgia O'Keeffe period because I find flowers suddenly like really gorgeous in a way that I never noticed before. And I also live in a part of I grew up in Arizona, in Phoenix, and it was a desert. So there wasn't a ton of that around. And now I live out in the Chicago area and there's full seasons and there's like, spring.
Seasons.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's a lot more to photograph, I think, in that way too, which helps.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I interrupted. You were going to ask something, I think.
Yeah. So to kind of go back to, you wanted to be a chemical engineer, your grandfather, right?
Yeah,
chemical engineer. Okay. Something there I wanted to ask about is it seemed like you had kind of a deep curiosity that's like part of your personality that drives you. You want to understand how things work. And that's, at least in my own life, I can identify with that big time. But I do find that it sometimes winds up taking energy away from creating stuff. Like I'm so curious about how something works. I could spend days just absorbing something and then come out of it and be like, oh, wait, wasn't I trying to build something?
Since you mentioned World of Warcraft earlier, I think that it's also sort of, this is where the poison is. It's a superpower because you're able to delve really deep into issues that other people find boring or uninteresting, especially when you're talking about code. It's like, okay, I'm going to go find the web of how all of this works and how all of this is put together. But that brain chemistry that has you go after those tasks, when you are met with something like World of Warcraft, like that is now your task. So I don't know if you have had this, but basically I've had phases of playing World of Warcraft or any other sort of quest-based game where I get really invested in the quests and finding everything and doing everything. Or for example, Dragon Age, there's side quests, or Skyrim, bunch of I just do all these, so many side quests. And then if I separate from it for 2 days, 3 days, then I'm like, oh, I don't care about this. It's fine. I don't know why I was so invested in that. I don't know if you've had that experience too, but I think it's driven from sort of the same place.
Totally. And I love how the term side quest has actually become a term that people use in general for anything that distracts them from the main thing. Yeah. Just in life. Yeah, I've totally had that experience. And for me, it was Diablo 2, which is like such a classic Skinner box. It's ridiculous. I was like, I remember playing in, this must have been 2006 or 7, something like that. And I'm sitting at my computer and it's late at night and I couldn't sleep. And so I'm sitting here playing Diablo and I'm thinking to myself, like, how much physical energy am I actually putting into this? Because I'm barely just moving my mouse and click, 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 click for hours. And I remember while playing, just thinking like, what am I doing? And then I just keep playing. And then when the Resurrected one came out, I was like, we're going to revisit this. It was fun.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, I do think curiosity is big driving factor for me. Very curious. It is a superpower and also a curse. I think that I definitely have a lot of issues because I'm interested in learning more about how everything works and less interested in completely finishing everything all of the way, all of the time. And my favorite part of any learning is sort of, you've seen those graphs where it's super steep at the beginning and then it levels off onto a plateau. The super steep learning curve is my favorite part. So I go very wide, more of a generalist of learning a little bit about a lot of different things instead of becoming a specialist in one area. And then it's also useful. Having different context on a lot of different areas is useful. And especially when you get into business, where we were talking about, I tend to take on an organizing role. I kind of understand the basics of how a lot of different pieces work, but not the specifics, except for maybe my area. And it is just a different way of interfacing with the world that you have to work out how best to achieve 100% completion on something when you keep getting distracted.
Totally. And I have that same curiosity thing where I love a why question. Okay, but why does it work that way?
Yeah.
And for the longest time, it was really frustrating to me, for example, to work with people who they weren't wired that way. And I didn't understand that they were just different. And like, maybe I was weird in my own way too.
Yeah.
And I wound up falling into a lot of those same roles where it's like, well, somebody's got to connect all these dots. Somebody's got to organize this. Somebody's got to keep track. And I went through this phase from being kind of frustrated by it. Like, why can't everybody be organized, to, oh, hey, this is actually a really useful skill. Not everybody has it. And that means that I will excel in certain things. And I can just embrace that fact that like certain things that are hard for other people are easy for me. And if I just choose those things, that's where a lot of I think the comfort and the being able to let go of the worry about work and income and all that stuff kind of comes in as I finally came to a place where I understood myself better about like, what am I good at and what is high stress and low stress for me and easy and hard? And how can I consciously choose those things instead of feeling like I'm just bumped around?
Yeah. I think it's such a valuable thing to learn. And I don't know, even when I assume when you were going through it too and trying to figure out yourself and how you interface and all these things, people will tell you, oh, you have to learn how to push back and manage your priorities and all of these things. And it doesn't quite click until you go through it yourself, at least from what I've seen. There's so many different areas where that's true, especially when you're talking about working and careers. There's just so much that you sort of have to learn from experience, because when someone says it to you the first time, you're like, I don't know exactly what you're talking about. And then like when we were having our conversation yesterday, we were making jokes about random things that occur in the workplace. It's like, no, I get it. I 100% get that. But if someone hadn't been going through the similar experience to us, they would not have understood our jokes at all, probably.
Yeah. And I think our experience is pretty universal for people that are wired similarly to us.
Yeah.
For sure. So there's a couple of threads in there I want to tug on. One is we were talking about investing in others, taking the time to say, help an engineer through something. At this point in my life, I'm so grateful to all the people that were taking the time to help me. And I had no idea they were doing it even most of the time. And they just like were slowed down. It's like, Jeff, you're thinking about this the following way. I want you to think about it this way.
Yeah.
And then go crunch on that for a while and then come back.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful that they gave me the space to do that.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that you don't notice is happening until after you've been at the other end of it. But yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm sort of still in the middle where there's people who are above me who know a lot of things. And so I'm still a junior in some respects. And also other respects, there's certain things that I'm more senior on. And then of course, people, since I'm organized and I try to massage projects into a way that they will be easier for the team to complete, I end up in sort of a team lead sort of role on accident, even if that's not necessarily what the company is paying me to do. I forgot where I was going with that, but it was related to sort of mentoring other people who are learning. And it's that thing where you are the new person at a company, and then it's been a couple of years, and now you're not the new person anymore. And everyone's asking you how everything works. You're like, wait a minute, I'm not that old. Like, I haven't been here that long. I don't know.
Yeah. I always feel like I never completely have my feet under me. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of exacerbated by the really tight timelines that a lot of companies are working with, and, cutting back resources, laying people off, all of those sorts of things sort of compound together to make it extra fun.
Yeah. We'll put the positive spin on it.
Fun, new challenges, new things to learn.
Yeah. It's funny when, like, if I'm screen sharing in a meeting at work, for example, and let's say I'm in a meeting with the engineers on my team, and if my calendar flashes onto the screen, everyone's like, oh my God. Like, they're like, is this what it's like to be a tech lead? I was like, yeah, a lot of conversations, a lot of time, things together. And they're like, oh my God, that sounds horrible. And I remember being in that thing and thinking, oh, the engineering progression is I get really good at programming, and then I just keep building and building and building to the point where I'll just be theorizing about systems all the time and it'll be amazing. And it's like, nope. Once you get good enough, someone's going to ask you to start helping other people. And then more and more of your job turns into how can your skill set help a team of 10 people? Yeah. And I definitely thought that it was going to be this just like amazing programming utopia or whatever, right? Yeah. But it's like, no, somebody's got to shovel the shit. And it turns out that's the leaders.
Yeah, that's very, very true. I think also some companies have gotten better where they have sort of a lead manager track and an individual contributor track, and that's really nice. But there's also a ton of problems that the individual contributors understand how to solve. A lot of it involves sort of a little more DevOps-y connecting pieces as opposed to specifically working with the code. It's also integrating it into other systems, even if you have a dedicated DevOps teams. There's a bunch of stuff. Anyway, the technical leads and the managers don't necessarily understand certain technical challenges. And so even the individual contributors who are sort of theoretically supposed to be doing everything, programming all the time, are in so many meetings because they have expertise in a different area that the technical managers, and they just don't know how to answer those questions that leadership or whoever will have about, hey, can we do this? And so no matter what you're doing, if you understand how something works, people are going to start asking you questions. And then you get into the way that we've been working nowadays is on like Slack or Teams or whatever. Also, Teams is terrible, but I don't have to get into that. And so you are available at all of the time unless you set yourself to do not disturb or you set aside time to respond to things. And so your attention is getting fragmented. And at least for me, when I'm coding, I think about having an internal RAM in my own brain that I'm shoving all of the connections into. And so I need to sort of build up my local memory of how everything is connected to solve the problem. And so then if I'm getting pulled into these side conversations, questions about, oh, hey, this bug came back and it came back in this way. Do you know what that problem is? Oh, hey, we're going to be working on this feature next. Do you know if we can build that and how long it'll take? And if you start to try to answer those questions exactly when they come up, yes, it will be nice for the people who are asking you those questions, but you're also fragmenting your ability to focus and actually solve the problems that you're trying to solve. There's so many different things to talk about and unpack.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the things you said is so perfect, which is that as soon as you start to become more of an expert, even in just a couple of areas, you start to become the person that people go to when they need help. And to kind of tie a thread back to something you said earlier about long-term goals and short-term goals, everybody is executing on both all the time. And this is something that sounds like you're figuring out or have largely figured out, this separation between you can make yourself available all the time. Yes, you can fragment yourself infinitely. That's one way to approach it. But you can also intentionally decide, okay, there's a time to reply to short-term things and there's a time to make progress on long-term things. But like there's basically an infinite number of people who are going to want to come to you as a curious person who's delved deep into something to help them with their short-term goals. And you have to have some boundaries just to keep yourself from going crazy or burning out.
Yeah. Lots of those. And then also sort of short-term versus long-term. And also trying to design the structure of the team such that you don't create immediately blocking issues, to use the terminology that we use in corporate of, okay, this person, you've given them this to work on, let's say designing a feature. So you think about it more linear in terms of, okay, I'm going to have this person design it and this person engineer it, but there's all of this crossover that needs to happen. And then questions need to get asked, questions need to be answered. So there's these sort of, you have to wait for a response. And so if you only give someone one thing to work on that has a lot of those, I need to ask a question and then get the answer, then they're going to be just completely blocked. And so you also have to have like maybe small bugs that are existing, other things like that. Or if you're talking about bugs, having a system where if someone's QAing it, they don't need an immediate answer from the engineer, which most places are good about this. They, put information in the ticket, they pass it back. And then there's all sorts of jokes about QA and engineering passing tickets back and forth.
Yeah. Plenty of memes about that too.
Yeah. Which are hilarious. I forgot where I was going with that. I was talking about designing processes to facilitate a reduction in those immediate interrupts such that you become better as a team about communicating asynchronously or just sort of leaving messages. Also, tracking information in text form such that it is searchable. At least in my opinion, I find it extremely useful. And also then when something comes up at the end of the project, hey, didn't we say we were going to do this? And then you can say very specifically, no, we said this, and here is exactly where we talked about it, and here is exactly where everyone agreed on it, which maybe there's a business reason why you do need to iterate and you got to do all of that, et cetera, et cetera. But you at least have very clear, this is what we talked about, as opposed to what happens in other places, which is what I'm currently dealing with my part-time job, where no one tracks anything anywhere in text form. There's a bunch of meetings that occur. No one knows what is actually trying to be built. And so that's been a very fun, new, interesting challenge to figure out how to even get the information out of the system that currently exists such that I can create a reasonable plan for what we're going to work on and how long it's going to take to build. And this is very normal for designs, at least from my experience, where people are trying to build this design and they keep iterating on it, which is probably good in the sense that you're getting closer to a design that you will actually want to have at the end. But you also have no clarity on what you even need to build, which then changes some of the assumptions that you might have made in terms of what systems are you going to create to run this, because that'll change depending on what you're trying to do, which approach is going to be the better one. Anyway.
That kind of gets into the theme about communication that we also touched on, which is that so I don't remember when I started to appreciate just how much of work of this sort is communication.
Yeah.
And effective communication. And that includes writing stuff down, being organized, and all that stuff. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, when I imagine my childhood self listening to the kinds of words I use at work all the time, and like something you just said, right? Like, how would your childhood self react to, well, what we need to do is structure the team such that we can facilitate asynchronous processes, et cetera, et cetera. My childhood self would just be like, you're a sellout. Oh my God, it happens. This is the future.
Yeah. And we sort of were joking about that too, where you think about how management, quote, management is organizing the team or doing certain things or making certain decisions, and how you're like, that's stupid. Why would you ever do it that way? And then you start to become more responsible for a team as a whole or processes and decisions. And then you're like, oh God, I'm doing some of the same things that I didn't like. Like, how do we fix this? I don't know yet.
Yeah, because it turns out when this is one of my favorite things to do with people as well. They're like super ambitious and they're coming up and they want to do stuff. And they will sometimes people will just pretty much tell you, you're an idiot, you're wrong, you should do it this way. And I was like, okay, well, I could debate, or I could say, hey, you seem to have a really strong belief about how this should be done. You've built project XYZ and that's went well. Would you like to just run with this? And sometimes I just get out of their way and be like, yeah, go for it. And 6 months later, they're doing the exact thing they told me was wrong, because it turns out, and I've been through this too, right? Because I've been the person that's like, I can't believe management made this decision. It's so horrible. It's so obvious, blah, blah, blah. But then when you're in the thick of it, you're like, oh, there's a lot of information I didn't have. There's a lot of factors that now that I have that information, it actually gives me a lot more empathy for the people that were helping me come up through the chain, because it's like, oh, if I were making the same decisions with the same constraints in the same timelines they were, it turns out I would basically do it the same way, because that's what actually makes sense. And so you're like, oh, I guess I'm actually a little bit of a jerk, and maybe I should trust that people are trying to do their best most of the time, given what they have.
Yeah. Yeah. And it happens a lot where there's a lot of people working on a team or on a problem who are trying to do the best that they can. And due to sort of the nature of how everything is structured, or the way that the problem came into being, or the very tight timeline that for some reason was agreed upon for the work that needs to get done, it ends up being stressful. But it's not because people are trying to do bad. Granted, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but at least where I've worked, luckily, people are trying to do a good job and solve problems. And it's a matter of helping us get out of our own way and try to fix some of the other things that are surrounding it.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah. So that's all great. And yeah, it's really comforting that work is work. And when reflecting on that,
experiences.
And it's neither this hero's journey where everything's going to be awesome, nor is it terrible, actually. It's exactly that chart you posted about, like, there's highs and lows, but so long as you keep at it, there's this steady upward progression, which is really great.
Though I do think that there are probably some personality types, we're sort of similar in some ways. I think that are probably some personality types that will end up sort of stagnating at work. I wonder because, so for example, at least when you're considering quote unquote success in terms of your position moving up, getting a raise, things like that, I have definitely been someone who pushes back and asks for more. And I also am very particular about tracking the work that I do, tracking the quotes of things that people say, hey, you've done this really well. I'm really glad to work with you on this project. And then presenting that in the annual reviews, such
Mhm.
that I have a lot of strong evidence that then my manager can use to go up and argue for my promotion. And while I have not actually experienced for the most part, it immediately works when I then push back and say, hey, you gave me outperforming, but you gave me 3%, which was actually below blah, 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 blah. It's like the regular amount was 2.5% and outperforming was 3%. And I was like, okay, well, if you want me to keep outperforming, I'm going to need more than 0.5% for that. And so that did end up working to help me get more of a raise. And also in terms of getting, more of a title change, getting to senior, things like that. But I think that if you're talking about that vector, I think some people may have a harder time keeping on an upward trend. And I don't know enough about that personally because I'm not that personality type, but I just meant as a caveat asterisk that that's probably also an experience people have.
Definitely. And I think a lot of people, the promotion process in particular in most places is totally opaque. And I've been a manager before, and so I've gotten some insight into it. And I've talked to a lot of the managers I've worked for that have been more open about it as they're able to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a period where if you decide you want to focus a lot of energy on your career progression in however you define that, titles, income, whatever, there's a ton of things to learn to go on that curiosity journey. But the way I would summarize it is you can get most of that value out of just doing a few basic things. And they're the things you've identified, which are like, I'll actually relate this to something else you said earlier, right? So if you can be organized, keep track of things, and make a case for why, for example, you should get a promotion or a certain raise, what you're effectively doing for your manager is making their job of advocating for you. Because if you're someone who's great on their team, they already want you to succeed. But if you put in that extra effort, you're making their job to make the case easier, which actually increases the chance you're going to get it. It's not 100%, right? And budgets are limited, and you could be the best performer on the team, and the company as a whole could just be in a decline, and there's just no way anybody's getting a raise, right? But that approach of just like, how can you be the person who's the expert in this thing so that your boss's job is easier makes a huge, huge difference, right?
Yeah. But anyway, it sounded like you wanted to switch to another topic.
Yeah. So we've been talking about workplace stuff and just normal things. And that's cool. All of us live in that space a lot of times. But what you and I connected over originally was the creativity part. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to talk about, like, I'm starting to put more energy into carving out creative time. And it sounded like, correct me if I'm wrong here, you also are working part-time instead of full-time, and you've carved out some space for your creative stuff. So tell me how you arrived at, like, now's the time to do that, and what were some of the decisions you made along the way and factors you balanced to say, like, making that leap versus just continue to invest, say, in your career or whatever?
One thing that makes it easier is, like you had said earlier, where you have a skill that is marketable. So my plan for a while had been to exit the corporate working life and to invest time in trying to make something that had some sort of monetary ability to sustain at least some of my cost of living. So sort of as a long-term goal, I wanted to figure out, how can I stop being a corporate engineer and start being my own engineer? So there was a couple of things to consider in that journey. First of all, finances, massively important. So what I did was save a bunch of my income. And so, like, I was living in an apartment where we lost water, and I was making actually a good salary, but I was living somewhere where, we lost water for a week and we lost electricity for 2 weeks. There was some stuff that was happening in our area that caused a lot of places to lose. Ours just happened to be worse. But I have family nearby. I was able to go stay with them. It's like, okay, that sucks, but I'm also able to save a lot more money living there. And it didn't affect me that much. It's just like, okay, sometimes you have not very warm shower, things like that. So some sacrifices in those areas, which personally for me didn't affect me that much, not buying any new clothes, just cutting back on certain costs to just keep my cost of living from increasing so that I could live off of a very small amount of money and save a very large amount of money. A, for, investing for retirement in the future, those sorts of things. And B, for investing in the ability to take a sort of sabbatical, which I had previously actually already tried, where I had worked for a while and then I took a year and a half off and tried to do my own thing, but I didn't have a plan. So I realized that I made a mistake the first time around, not having a plan. So this time around, I wanted to have a much more structured idea of what I was going to do and how long I was going to give myself to try this. I'm started rambling again, but the overarching idea is, how do I save money so that I can take X amount of time off to try to build something myself? Because I have shown that I am very valuable when working for a company, as seen by the feedback that I receive from others. What if I tried to use that value to produce something that was more of a benefit for myself over the long term? And since I'm still somewhat young, I have the flexibility to be able to take on that type of risk, because there's definitely a way that this goes where I lose all of my savings, which granted, I ended up accidentally getting a part-time job. So that's probably not going to happen, but there was a way that this went where basically I lose all of my savings. Granted, there's some that I've set aside that's like, okay, you don't touch this because that's for retirement, et cetera. But all of the money that I saved for living off of to try to do my creative pursuits, I could just lose all of that and then have to start working again. Like, that is something that could have happened. And so that's the risk that I decided that I was willing to take. So that's sort of what I was thinking of leading up to it. I'm going to give you an opportunity to interrupt if you want to redirect me, since I've been sort of rambling a little bit.
So you touched on saving up money to kind of de-risk it to some degree. I wanted to actually dig more into that first sabbatical you took. I think it's a pretty common fear to say, we'd all love to take our year off to go backpack in Europe or whatever the metaphor is, right?
Yeah.
But for me, for sure, there was always a fear like, well, if I do that, there's a lot of rhetoric in the ether that says that, like, oh, if you ever stop working, you're going to lose all your marketability. And not only when you go back, is it going to be hard, you're going to have to like go backward. Did you have that experience?
That is a really good question. A little bit. It was definitely psychologically a little intimidating to be going back after taking some time off. I did end up making slightly less, but it wasn't by much at all when I got my first job back. It was a very small hurdle from my experience. I was able to get another job pretty quickly. It was just more so my own mental thinking about how, oh my gosh, did I forget how to do all of coding? Am I actually worthless? Those sorts of issues, as opposed to it actually being more difficult to get a job. Granted, I was also switching to a new industry, so from business software to more game development. And so I was leaning a little bit heavier on my experience in college, where I was actually working in game engines to build games. So that was a lot of relevant experience. I think as long as you have relevant experience, you'll be able to find a position, and you might have to start slightly lower. But I mean, if you're going to be taking time off, that's sort of a risk that you have to take. But I don't think that it's actually an issue where you won't really be able to get back in. You just might have to start lower. But also, while I technically started lower, I actually ended up completely doubling that salary over 4 years. So I was able to get promoted and raises very quickly. Granted, I did push a lot for myself to get those and also switch to another job. But I think that it's actually a lot less of an obstacle than people think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure in tech, especially, that there's this belief that things are moving so fast that if you're not constantly riding the wave, you're just going to be left behind. And what I would say that turns out to be false most of the time, so long as when you come back, you work hard at it, is because, well, you had to close that gap to get the job in the first place. So you've already done it. You can definitely do it again. So if there's anybody out there sort of considering a similar thing, I would say that particular aspect, there are things to be worried about, right?
Yeah.
But that particular aspect, in my experience, also wasn't true. I had kind of a similar thing where I left programming, and the person, my greatest mentor at the time, and somebody who definitely had my back, but was also, as I quit my job, was like, programming's a really great career. Like, are you really going to just give that up?
Yeah.
Like, what if this thing doesn't work out? And it turned out that, I left, went and did digital marketing for a little over a year, and then came back. And I'm wondering if you had experience where the fact that you left and you were kind of on your own more gives you a different experience than just being in the job all the time? And were there skills from that experience that you brought back into the job? And do you think any of those skills partially led to the eventual doubling that you were talking about?
I think the skills are definitely useful. I think probably the most important was, and I talked about this earlier, is sort of realizing that the job isn't the problem. So whenever I start to feel negative about anything that's occurring in the work environment, it's usually at the root something that's wrong with me. And for me personally, it's often that there is a problem that I don't know how to solve, and there is a deadline for that problem to be solved. And so then that creates a lot of stress. And understanding that that's just inherent to how I exist and is not necessarily an issue with the job. And so I think it just helped me be more sustained in working a job and not trying to go too hard all at once and keeping a little bit more of a steady pace working, if that makes sense. Because I think before I fell into a trap of sort of trained from school, perhaps, where you have an assignment and you sort of like, and then you work really hard right up until the end of the assignment. Mm-hmm. And I think that taking the time off helped me level that out a little bit more. There was something else about the question that you just asked. So it was, well, can you repeat the...
You actually touched on it at the end there really well, which is school and the career pipeline and everything gives you a pretty structured environment for the most part. But when you go out and do your own thing, suddenly you're left to provide your own structure and decide what level of structure is helpful to you.
Yeah.
And when I did the marketing thing, it was a completely different industry. I barely touched a computer at all, except to like manage ads on a platform and stuff. And suddenly I was in a position, for example, now I was relying on programmers to go implement the things that we needed for marketing. Right? Yeah. And for me, it completely changed my perspective in a couple of ways. One is suddenly I was on the receiving end of engineering's arguments about why things can't work. And I had previous experience and I tried never to debate with them. I took it as like, oh, this is how I sound when talking to business people.
Yeah.
Now I get so much more about the business people's response to that. So that was cool. But then it also changed my perception of structure, and that like somebody has to make up a structure so that we achieve some goal at some point. And I think one of the biggest skills I came back into engineering with was just a deeper understanding of the business side, and not in like a business school sense, but just the mentality and the reality that the business folks live in every day.
Yeah.
And now suddenly I was way better able to talk with them, which turned out to be a skill I didn't even know existed. That would be valuable. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. In a similar vein, now that it was actually this sort of sabbatical that's not quite a sabbatical that I'm taking, now that I've actually technically started my own business, and my boyfriend also actually has 2 businesses, being someone who's in charge of a business or seeing the sorts of decisions and cost of random things that come up from running a business has definitely changed my perspective on everything. My boyfriend and I joke when we go out to eat, like we'll see what sort of takeout containers they have, because one of the things that he has to do is package products. And so we look at a lot of containers. And so it's sort of like gauging how much money they spent on their takeout containers and how that cost affects the business. And there's just so many things that I think about differently now that I have a little bit more insight into how the entrepreneurial side works. Back to the first sabbatical, I think there was something else that you had asked about that I wanted to talk about, and now I can't. There's so much. This is the ramble time.
Yeah. I wanted to know if you felt like the sabbatical experience, okay, so we were talking about the fear that taking that leap, that going away from the corporate life was somehow going to be a huge long-term disadvantage. And it sounds like for you, it hasn't been. I had a similar experience. And so I'm curious, basically, what things did you bring back from the sabbatical that turned out to be huge benefits that you probably couldn't have gotten any other way than trying it?
Yeah.
As opposed to the fear that might have been in your head about like, well, if I do this and it doesn't work out, my life is over.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how to answer that one. I'm not thinking of any specific examples right now. I'm sure there's a bunch, because my mindset about work changed significantly after having done that. But yes, if anybody is considering taking that time off, if you have the financial ability to do so, I think it's very valuable to just sort of experience another way of existing. It also sort of takes you out of the day to day. And at least in our field, I feel like often companies, they just treat things that are on fire all the time. And I had one mentor who would tell me that if everything's on fire, nothing's on fire, which I'm sure has said a lot. And just sort of also getting a little more context on when someone says something it's important, being able to understand if it's actually important and the timeline of how long you actually have to respond to something. Because it's very easy when you're just starting out to think that everything is of the utmost importance. And especially if it comes from a manager or someone higher up in the chain, quote unquote, that you have to jump on it right away and it's super important. And actually, none of that is true. If you consider the business, you can also consider the team, but you consider how does that request for you to take some action actually affect the business? And another thing that I thought a lot about was bringing value to the company, or which is a horrible, horrible thing to think about. Like if you think about past you and you're like, how do you bring value to the company? It's like, okay, well, not quite like that, but it's more so, how do I ensure that I am doing actions that allow me to keep my job and increase my value in terms of what I am getting out of, because and also a lot about like, okay, well, what am I actually doing at a job? I am literally trading my time for money. Now, there are some different jobs where you might have where you're actually getting different things out of the job. Maybe you are the type of person who likes to socialize and you get other sort of interpersonal satisfaction out of the job, all these sorts of other things that you can do. But at the root of it is like, okay, someone had an idea, they created a business, and they needed people to be able to do all of those things so that they could generate value for themselves or bring this thing into the world. And so it's sort of like, okay, if someone is having me fill a role doing this, like I'm literally trading my time for money. But what if I traded my time for the possibility of future money for me? And that's sort of what I was thinking about when I was thinking about exiting again, sort of going on a bunch of different paths here. But the taking time off and understanding that that's a way of existing. Ooh, this was the thing that I was thinking about before. When you take time off, the social, interpersonal ramifications of that in at least American society are extremely negative. So trying to tell my parents or my friends or other people, hey, I just decided to quit my job because I can, like I have the luxury of having enough savings to be able to do that, is a very weird position to be in. It's a lot easier for people to understand the position that I'm in now, which was different from the first time I took time off, which is, hey, I have this part-time job. That wasn't actually initially the plan, but it ended up happening that way. So it's been much easier to explain to friends, family, what I'm doing in a way that they can understand it, because we as a society are not very comfortable with the risk that's associated with attempting to start your own business, or even just working on a creative project just to work on it, even if you're not trying to get monetary value out of it. It's a very weird concept for people to understand. So that definitely has a large impact on your interpersonal relationships when you choose to do something like that.
Big time. I got blindsided by that.
Yeah.
For example, I got told when I was doing the digital marketing stuff with a partner, like I got told that I didn't have a real job because I didn't work for somebody else.
Yep.
And I was like, well, I'm making an income. So it's like, okay, so how do we define what a real job is? But there was this tension that I didn't even realize was there until I ran into the exact thing you're talking about, which is people are just like, you just did that? Are you nuts? You know?
Yeah.
In a much smaller way, I got a lot of that. And it was also blindsided about it when I moved from Arizona to Chicago. So I took the least risky possible way to do that, which is I was working for a company and they wanted to open an office in Chicago. And I literally just volunteered and said, I will do that. Yeah. I grew up in Arizona. I was looking for a way to kind of branch out. And I just took the first opportunity, right? That's how I was looking at it. But I was literally like leaving on a Wednesday, driving to Chicago. And on Monday, I was going to do the exact same job with people that I had just hired. Yeah. Just in a different location. Physical location was it. Yeah. And I got so much, people surprised me when they were like, at first they were like, you're crazy, that's dangerous, whatever, just a lot of fear stuff.
Yeah.
And then after that, they would say, you're so brave. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm moving from one house to another. And it really surprised me. It gave me an awareness I didn't have of how much fear there is around those kinds of changes.
Yeah.
But it also changed the way I thought about it. It's like, oh, there's this whole area of things that are not really that risky, it turns out. But so many people are risk averse to that by choosing it, I'm sort of expanding the choices in my life just by doing something that's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I'm really glad that I ended up choosing that path because it's led to a lot of interesting insights, which is sort of what you were getting at before. But yeah, if anybody is listening to this and is thinking about doing that, it's probably not as bad as you think, but also there's a lot of random extra stuff that comes with that decision that you have to navigate. I was actually quite pleased when I ended up accidentally getting this part-time job that I have. The context behind that is essentially I had made the decision to leave my game development job to try to make my own games or creative projects. And I was going to take 2 years off. And then, of course, I had started telling people, hey, I'm leaving my job. And then I got a call like, hey, I heard you're available. Would you be interested in helping us do this thing? And I actually got more than
you've
one
got this
call.
whole reputation for being great at things.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And it turns out you get to keep that reputation.
Yeah. Which, okay, networking is extremely important. I know that a lot of people don't like networking. They don't like having to do it, but there are so many opportunities. And also the games industry is actually surprisingly small. Granted, what I ended up doing is actually not the games industry, but I also got a call from someone else who was like, hey, we're starting up this new game project, but I had already taken this other opportunity. Anyway, networking is more important than you would like it to be. So if you are someone who is towards the beginning of your career, even if it's just sort of getting the emails of someone who you worked with, like there's a couple of art directors that I used to work with that I just talk to very occasionally over email, just like a, hey, what's up? Here's what I've been doing. It's also just fun to stay in touch with interesting people, but you get a lot of opportunity from having positive relationships with people and having a good working history. So, don't burn bridges, talk to people, don't be afraid to just reach out to someone who you've worked with before. And I think this gets more into interpersonal side is I used to be very nervous about reaching out to someone who I hadn't talked to in a while. But then I started framing it more so of like, what if X person who I used to work with randomly messaged me? It's not like I'm going to go, oh my gosh, how dare they send me an email asking how I've been doing and telling me about what they've been up to. Like, I'm so offended. Like, you'd be interested to hear from someone who you worked with before. So when I started thinking about it more in terms of how would I feel if they were to message me, it became a lot easier to send a message saying, hey, how are you, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Especially if you liked working with that person.
Yeah. Another thing that I've done in the past is when I have left a position, sorry, this is more random stuff, but I actually wrote handwritten notes to some of the people that I really appreciated working with. And that's also been really nice to just sort of, just anything to connect with people more on a human level. Anyway, ramble over.
I want to go back to a couple of things. One was your comment about how do I bring value to the company immediately made me think of that scene in The Matrix where before Neo's disconnected or whatever, he's being drugged into his manager's office.
Yeah.
It's like, Mr. Anderson, like you need to find a way to be at your desk in the morning or whatever. Otherwise, you won't be here anymore. And it's so funny because I think when we all hear that, how do we bring value to the company? We imagine that kind of confrontational scenario. But it's, to your point, it's more like I've reframed it as, hey, we're all people trying to do our best. We're all on a team. How can I be a good team member to other people? And by doing that, we'll bring value to the company by accomplishing these goals. But to your point, like to kind of tie in the networking, all that stuff, just by being someone who is competent, works hard at being good at what you do, and you're nice to people, that's actually, it turns out to be the foundation of most careers, I think.
Yeah.
The skill building is obviously very important because you need to be able to apply all that stuff. But just being a good team member and thinking about other people's perspectives is a much greater insurance against that like apocalyptic blow up of your career than grinding away at lead code problems or something,
And for the value, I think it's also more so it's like, how do I increase my own value for myself? It's like, it's not necessarily that I'm thinking about like, I want to make the stakeholders more money. It's like, if I am seen and interpreted as valuable, that means that I am being valuable. And so it's not necessarily tied one to one, but you can just kind of move up in a company if you focus on being visibly valuable, which is another thing that is sort of terrifying to a lot of people, but is
I think a lot of people equate that to selling out, but it's not really the same thing.
It's me. I've sold out and then I left. Like, drop, I'm out of corporate now.
Right. There's the extreme interpretation of like ass kissing, basically, but it doesn't have to be that at all. It's just like, no, just like contribute to the success of projects over and over.
Well, I think ass kissing is actually counterproductive because A, a lot of times people can probably tell if you're being fake, and B, you're not actually trying to solve the problem. You're trying to look like you're solving the problem. And while being visually valuable is actually a key to success, I think long term, people can argue this, people will argue this, long term, it's not going to work for you. Granted, a lot of people would probably say, but there's a bunch of people who just did a bunch of ass kissing and now they're in like these top positions, which, okay, I guess. But being inherently valuable is its own nice to have.
I think the pool of opportunity to being valuable is so much larger than the political route.
Yeah.
That like, if you want to get to a place where you enjoy your work well enough, but you can disconnect from it and all that stuff, the key is actually just be valuable during the 40 hours a week and trust that doing that is going to connect you to this huge base in the economy where like there are jobs for valuable people, and worry less about the ladder climbing, unless you're just wired that way, in which case this podcast is not for you anyway.
Yeah. The other thing about, you were talking about helping your team. Basically, if you help your team members and you have an empathy for what it is that they are trying to do and what their day looks like, and if it's easy for you to just give them a little bit more information so that they don't have to hunt through and find it, or it's really easy for you to click a couple of buttons in some environment to turn something on or off for a tester to make their testing easier so that they don't have to go through 5 million steps to be able to do this. Like, anything that you can do to help make someone else's life easier, they will appreciate more than you just doing your job really, really well. And so that ties into being visible. If you are helping other people and making their lives easier, people will be noticing that you do that. People may argue that as well, but if you do it enough to other people in your team, people are going to be like, oh yeah, if you have a problem, go talk to Kat. Oh, this thing, it'll be easier to test if you can just use this tool that Kat built at this time, blah, 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 blah. And I think if you want to move up, you just can work in your team, which is what you were getting at. And that all helps you be a visible member of the team.
Yeah. So the overriding theme that I started this whole thing with, not this conversation, but this podcast, was talking to people who do a job during the day, but have some creative thing they either do for fun as a hobby or they would like to do more of. Yeah. And so that's like an overarching theme. And this just happens to be probably the most on point conversation about those decision points. Mm-hmm. We've spent so much time on the work stuff, which is totally important to people. I want to end on a hopeful thing about the creativity, because I think we've spent a lot of time grounding people and saying, hey, work is not as either good or bad as you think it is. A healthy boundary is actually great. And I think I also want to touch on startup culture and grind culture and how that is also, in my experience, mostly a lie to try to get you to work harder for somebody else, and how you can actually gently branch into this stuff. And it doesn't have to be this hard cutoff that like, I'm a corporate employee or I'm doing my own thing and they don't mix. It's actually, there's a whole spectrum there.
Yeah, there is a whole spectrum. To give more context on sort of my creation while having a job, I'm actually working on a novel that I've been working on since 2021, which has a bunch of other interesting things to talk about. Sort of the larger point would be that I tried to pick a project that was too big, which is a very common mistake for someone working on something creative. And so then after starting that novel, I ended up picking a more pared down, easier novel to write. And so now I'm working on that. And the way that I handled that while working is getting up early and spending at least an hour every day, even if I'm not physically writing more words, just writing or thinking about the story or researching. And that, while sometimes I do sleep in, has been very helpful. I think the consistency, even if you're doing something small, is very important to keep going. And I think that one thing I've heard in terms of writing advice applies to a lot of areas, which is basically just don't stop, because when you stop, that's when you've failed. If you just keep doing it, okay, it might take you a very, very, very long time. But if you keep working towards the goal and allocating time to it and just carving out a little bit here and there, you're going to keep getting closer. Okay, maybe not close. Sometimes it might be a little bit cyclical, but you will at least be moving generally in the direction of your goal. And I think that the consistency and scheduling time was probably the most important in terms of having time for creative outlets while I had a job.
I think that is so true. And it kind of touches on something you mentioned about having a plan this time.
Yeah.
A little more structure, right? It doesn't have to be this all or nothing, risk all your life savings and everything. And if you're not successful, it's doom and gloom, right? That is just like the extreme end of the interpretation of that story, I think. It gets repeated a lot. But it's like you said, you're literally writing a book and working on a game, right?
Yeah.
But so many things can be broken down like that. It's like there's definitely a tendency to take on something huge, because now that you've found the time and you're taking the time, it's super motivating to say, okay, now I'm going to write my magnum opus, right? Like I'm going to write the novel of novels, right? But if you just think of it as like pages in a finished book, and just every day I'm going to try to get a little closer. And so long as you can eventually rein in the scope and kind of say, there's a version of this creative thing that's going to be done.
Yeah.
And when I get there, I'm going to ship it. It's going to be finished.
Yeah.
And it makes so much more difference having the habit of just cranking away at it than thinking that I'm going to have some creative spurt and go crazy for 2 months and just knock all this work out. Like it just doesn't work that way for me.
Yeah. I think also talking about sort of a creative spurt is the inspiration is not a constantly on valve. And then also in terms of when I'm feeling dry or writer's block or something like that, I find consuming other content is somewhat inspirational in that maybe I'll watch a show and see how they've had two characters interact and think about that, or go outside and take a walk and look at some trees or see a squirrel doing something weird. And all of those external stimulus can then be sort of parsed, put into sort of a, hey, here's an idea of something that I can include as a small detail somewhere in the writing. So I think that the point I was going to make was basically inspiration isn't constant. And so if you cut off everything and try to work on your project 100% of the time, I think that you would struggle with that. At least I have, because you'll sort of run out of the steam. Another thing is trying to, at least for me, trying to structure it so that you have very small tasks at the beginning, because it's the getting started, at least for me, that's the hard part, where after I actually start, it starts to flow a little bit better. So I try to structure what I'm doing in such a way that I don't completely wrap something up, but I'll leave it with like a little task to do at the end, so that then when I get started the next time, I can get right into it, as opposed to trying to remember where I was and what I was doing and what I need to do next.
Yeah, it's like the side quest thing, right? Like you're working on a particular aspect of it. And I have the same experience, like all these other thoughts about like, oh yeah, but what about this? What about this? What about this? And I've also found that the habit of, okay, I'm going to take a few minutes and just write that down and put it over there and then come back to what I was trying to finish. Makes a huge difference, because a large portion of those things that come up in the moment turn out to be things that I don't actually want to do, or they were a creative spark, and I'm really glad that I took the moment to capture them. That's motivating on its own. I mean, like making the list of dreams you want to accomplish feels really good, but then turning my attention back to, okay, but I want to finish this thing. Like, for example, my game is like deployed via website. So it's like, no, I want to finish this feature I started on so I can get that to players and then iterate. Yeah. Those two things are really good. And it actually turns out that all of the work experience, like that's what a job is. And being comfortable with that process is really helpful, because when you're the one in the driver's seat and no one else is setting your deadlines, it's nice to have that habit.
Yeah. It's also very easy when you're in the driver's seat to just sort of like, oh, well, I had a family this thing come up, so I wasn't really at my computer, so I wasn't able to work on it, and we were chatting. And so then stuff starts to sort of fall through if you don't try to hold yourself to a certain goal, or even if you fail at the goal, make a new one and try to understand why you weren't able to accomplish it. There's so many things that you could talk about.
There's a meme that popped in my head a few times in our conversation. You know that meme where it's like a bell curve, and on the left and the right side are the same thing. So it'll be like, just use C, and in the middle will be like all these other languages and like all these whatever. And the whole point is like you kind of start and end at the same place.
Yeah.
But what's funny, whenever I see one of those, is like, yes, but the journey is actually important. It's not that the middle is a distraction per se. Like some of it is, but when you're on the right side of the graph, you have a much deeper understanding why the simple thing is super valuable in a different way than you did at the beginning, right?
I 100% agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. And it's also, so a lot of the stuff we were talking about at work could be applied to that. And even for creation, you can like just create, and then like all of the like, oh, but what about all of this stuff? What about like, do I need my own company to make the whatever it is? And then and it's like just create.
Taxes, legal, blah blah blah.
With its own fun problems to solve. But I think that for people who are creative, I think it's just create, just make anything. Even if you don't have time to build a game, if you wanted to make a game, or write a book, if you wanted to write a book, just sitting down with, if you like drawing, do a little bit of drawing. If you like baking, do a little bit of baking. If you like cooking, just to get your creative energy sort of flowing. Because I feel like, at least for me, if you're a creative person and you're not creating, which is something you touched on earlier, it hurts you to not be accomplishing something creative.
Yeah, it hurts. It like emotionally, physically hurts. And I get really depressed if I'm not building something. And it could be almost literally anything. Yeah. Like one of my favorite ways to get the creative spark back is just go for a walk and don't think about the game. Like go for a walk and notice the things around me, and just breathe. And I started a few months ago this habit that it's a piece of advice I'd heard a million times, but I finally feel like I get it, which is appreciate the journey. And so what I did is I have like a to-do app on my phone. And every time I think of something that I'm happy about, I write it down. And it's like my version of like a gratitude journal.
Yeah.
And I used to hear that advice and I'm like, that's so corny. That's not going to work, because if I'm not accomplishing this great creative feat, then like I'm worthless. So what good is, appreciating, these small things going to do? And what I realized finally is that I just focused way too much on the negative. And just by having a habit of getting myself to be appreciative of the smallest things, like one of the things on my list was the beauty of simple things, like a good sandwich was one of my lists. And then when I go for walks, I try to go for walks like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, once or twice a day. The habit is I leave my front door, I look at my phone and I say, I'm going to just pick anything off the list and say, oh yeah, I might have written it down 3 months ago, but I'm just going to think about the fact that I was happy about that I'm grateful for that. And that's what I think about on my walk. I put all the other to-do lists down and I just try to be in the moment.
I think we often end up accidentally focusing on achievements or what we have achieved. And then after we get to some achievement, we appreciate it very briefly. And then we're on to the next thing and thinking, wow, I'm so terrible. I can't do anything. Like totally forgetting all of what we have actually already accomplished because we're so focused on getting to the next hypothetical tier that we've envisioned for ourselves. So we sort of lose track of why we're even doing it in the first place.
Yeah, there's a kind of a beautiful naivete about wanting to accomplish something really hard. And it could be work or life or creative stuff, but not realizing how much work it's going to take. And then when you actually achieve it, you're like, man, that was so much work.
Yeah.
And for me, that kind of robs me a little bit of that gratitude because it's like, yeah, but I thought this was going to be a glorious outcome. And to kind of add on to the gratitude stuff, another thing I've tried to be a lot more intentional about is reflecting on what's gone well or reflecting on the body of work.
Yeah.
Like the other day, I just posted something about the evolution of the UI in my game over the last 6 months. And I have like the free tier of Jira that I use for my game project. I look at the Jira ticket numbers. And so I know the number of things I've written down. It's like 450 or something now in the last several months. I was like, holy crap, that's crazy. But I also think like, okay, like 200 of those are done though. Wow. Like look at all that work you did.
Yeah.
And I can see the difference. So when I look at the screenshots over time, I was like, I really did do something here.
Yeah.
And okay. The existential part of my brain can still pipe in and say, yeah, but you're still, this is all still pointless and the universe is empty. And what's the point? I was like, yeah. But it's fun. I'm doing it because it's fun. Like, leave me alone right now.
Yeah, it's so easy to accidentally not realize how much you've done because you're like, oh, look, it just does the thing. And you're like, oh, wait, but I added this little detail here and this little detail there. And it actually improves the entire outcome. But I sort of forgot that I did all of that work. And I started doing, I haven't been keeping up with it very well, but a dev log, mostly just for myself, to be able to track what I did so that when I forget how I did it or what it was, I can go look at it, and B, so that I can remember all of the different stuff that I worked on when I inevitably am like, what did I even do last week? I don't know what I did last week. It's like, oh, you actually figured out how to do behavior trees for movement of NPCs. Like, okay, that's actually useful. But
yeah, it's so powerful. It's like a reinforcing cycle when you can integrate that gratitude and that appreciation for the work you've already put in, like being generous to your past self, to continuing to feed that inspiration. I think it's one of those things where like, that saying where like, well, if I could time travel and go talk to myself 20 years ago, what would I say?
Oh, gosh.
And the funny thing is, it's like, whatever I would have said about, providing corporate value or whatever.
Oh gosh.
The thing is, I guarantee I was actually surrounded by people in real time giving me that advice. I just couldn't see it. So it wouldn't make any difference if I could time travel and talk to myself. I literally had people trying to help me.
Yeah. It's fascinating to be towards the other end. And I think also just sort of getting older, it's just fascinating to start to be the person who people go to or the person who's building something, as opposed to being, I was so used to being sort of the leaf at the end of everything, looking up at all these other things, be like, whoa, that's crazy. I don't know how you would ever become a trunk of a tree. Like, I don't know how you would do that. And you just sort of accidentally find yourself there one day and you look back and you're like, how did I, like, what? There was something my brother told me when I was in, I think, high school, and he had graduated and joined the workforce. And he was trying to tell me about how no one knows what they're doing and everyone's just making it up as they go along. Which at the time I was like, what do you mean? Like lawyers, like they have to know what they're doing. And it's like, they do kind of. But there's other things that you don't know. And so it's like you have to understand where you're at and like which aspects do you know about. And then there's other areas you know nothing about, and sort of understanding how it all works together.
Yeah, they know something about, and we all do this. We all know something about how to get through our day to day.
Yeah.
But we don't arrive at those big answers, those deeper answers, until we just do that every day for years. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like everyone, like the adults, like we're not actually adults. Like when you're a kid, you're like, oh, the adults have it all figured out. Like if they're 26, that's so old. Like they must have their whole life figured out. They've got it all together. And then you get to be that old and you're like, nope, it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. When trying to accomplish something for yourself, right? Like there's so much advice out there about how to approach it.
Yeah.
And what I've come to realize for myself is that I can try the productivity hacks and I can try just grinding away or whatever, following somebody's system. But at the end of the day, that's really just the description of what worked for them. And that's fine. And if you happen to overlap with that, that's great. But I don't know if you had this experience, but none of that stuff works for me. What works for me is just showing up and cranking away at it, because there's not some system that, oh, if I just do it this one way, all my dreams will come true. There's this sort of self-awareness process I had to go through where it's like, okay, but I'm wired a certain way And I'm sort of on a track to a degree that I did not realize that this is who I am. There were parts of that like I used to be really frustrated by. It's like, well, why can't I be like so-and-so,
Mm-hmm.
So it used to be a point of frustration. Now it's more self-awareness about what you're good at, what motivates you, what makes you happy is actually a big part of what unlocks the creativity you really want, which is just embracing who you are. And it sounds corny because people tell you your whole life, like, well, just be yourself. And right, that's like the right side of that graph where it's like, yeah, be yourself. But what does that mean?
Yeah. And like navigating everything. That's really interesting.
Feels like a good time to kind of wrap a little bit. By the way, thank you. This has been super.
Yeah. No, this was really, really fun. It was nice to chat some more about what we were talking about on the internet yesterday when we met. And now we are in person talking about some of the same stuff and creation and inspiration. And just sort of, if anybody is actually listening to this and got all the way to the end, that's kind of crazy. Hello. And I wish you all the best on your creative journeys. And if you're towards the beginning, you can enjoy having heard us tell you that the advice that you hear all of the time is useful. Ignore it. And then 5 years from now, you'll be like, some of that actually was useful. And so that'll be a fun journey for you.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely encourage people to just try it and don't frame your creative journey as, well, I have to dedicate myself to it or do corporate life. It's not an either or, I don't think. And you can very gently move into it or make a couple of small decisions, but try it out. And if it doesn't work, it'll be fine. There'll always be another job for the most part.
More jobs. That's not what we wanted.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in a place where like you're stable enough for your job, you're considering taking a leap, there's a pretty good chance that your plan B now is just to go back to work, and it'll probably be okay. Yeah. All right. So thank you for joining me. Where can people find you online, and what things creatively are you working on that you want people to know about?
So I have a very, very professional website at compkat.com, compkat.com. And there's not that much there, but I'm also on Bluesky and Twitter at CompositionKat. And mostly Bluesky is where I've been posting things. So if you were curious to see the game that I'm working on, you can find it there. My novel is not really available anywhere in any format yet, but if it does ever become available, it'll be announced somewhere on Bluesky. But yeah, I just love talking to people, and I'm really glad that we happened to come across each other on Bluesky yesterday. This has been a lot of fun, and thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad that I just happened to have the very next day off and this all worked out. It's been super fun. This has been the Wilderness and the Wellspring podcast. You can find me online on Twitter and Bluesky under the username at JeffLuntGames. You can also find my website, jeffluntgames.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.